3:47 p.m. August 4th, 1973. My name is Kevin Matthews. I am at the Matthews Lakeside Cabin in Black Rock Park, which I received in my dad's will. I'm writing this to document my odd findings of my family's lake house. I've been looking at real estate ads in the paper to get a good idea of how much I can get off this place. I then looked through some old newspapers and read articles about murders and strange unexplainable occurrences at a cabin by Lake Buchanan, called Camp Matt. After hearing of this, I had to get answers. 9:14 p.m. August 5th, 1973. Today I spoke to someone who witnessed some phenomena, a man named Clausen Andale. Mr. Andale said that he was staying at Camp Matt for about 3 days, and on the third night he said he saw a man standing under the tall oak out front, staring into the cabin windows. Another odd thing, Clausen said that the man was wearing the same clothes that he was imitating him. Another, Ruth Oakley, found her husband Dylan stabbed to death under the tall oak at Camp Matt in 1953. She swore her innocence to the police and that she had nothing to do with his death, but the only prints found on the knife were hers, and she claims she only touched the knife after pulling it out of her husband. She also told police that she locked the doors at night, but they were unlocked from the inside in the morning. After hearing about this tall oak out front both times, I realized this was no coincidence. Through more research, I found that Camp Matt was the name of this place up until 1954. Clausen's encounter happened in 1952. Ruth's in 53. I'm staying at a crime scene only 3 years younger than myself. This changes my whole perspective on things. 9 a.m. August 7th. I saw the man Mr. Andale described through the window, but this time he was dressed just like me. Blue jeans with a hole on the right knee, plaid shirt, and a ripped-up baseball cap. He didn't budge at all. Every hour or so I would wake up just to see him standing there in the exact same spot under the tree. I can't call the police. I can't leave. I fear for my life. August 9th. Time unknown. There is no longer any electricity in the lake house. I tried to leave when it was daylight outside, but when I opened the door it was night, and the man was still standing there. I think he's holding an axe. August 11th. It's morning again. I think. My watch says it's 5:13 p.m., but that's most likely false. I've been trying to keep track of the date, but this has all been very confusing. I think it's been 6 days. I've tried over and over to leave during the day, when it's safe, but every time I open the door it's fucking nighttime. My watch says 5:13 p.m., but it could be 9:35 p.m. or 3:18 a.m. or 11:29 p.m. or any other time other than 5:13 p.m. I've placed myself in this inescapable house, and the nearest telephone is 34 miles away in Llano. I'm helpless. Time unknown. Date unknown. I can no longer keep track of the date. I looked out the window and saw 8 corpses wrapped in sheets hung upside down on the branches of the tree, and they were soaked in blood. The man with the axe is still in his spot, waiting for me to step out of here. I've run out of options. I'm going outside. Time unknown. Date unknown. I'm outside. I stood in the light of a lamp mounted on the tree. I keep seeing a man inside the house. He keeps staring at me through the windows. He looks exactly like me. I found an axe at the tree's base. The man in the house is an imposter. He will come out of there, and when he does, it'll all be over. In 1998, I got a new teaching job in a new town. To save money, I moved into a small house that was for rent. My roommate, Claire, was nice enough, and the two of us got along easily. I moved in and found my room. While unpacking, I came across an old framed photograph. 3 men dressed as hospital orderlies were sitting together in the living room of the house. These 3 men had once lived in the house I was now renting with Claire. I didn't want to throw away the photograph, It didn't seem right. But I didn't want to keep it, either. I chose to hang the picture up in the living room as decoration and a reminder of the friendship that once bloomed in the house. On the first night, I was awakened by Claire stumbling around in the dark in my bedroom. Flipping on the lights, I saw Claire and realized that she was sleepwalking. I called her name and finally woke Claire up, and she, confused by what had happened, apologized and told me that she had never slept-walked before. Claire was shaking. She then went on to explain that she was having a vivid and bizarre dream. In her dream, she was in a hospital and a woman, a patient, was holding her hand and leading her down the hallway as if the woman wanted Claire to see something. The next morning, I went for a jog and spied an abandoned building a few blocks away from my house. The building was massive, the windows broken and the doors chained. There were no signs on the outside of the building, but by all outward appearances it looked like a hospital. I was staring at the building as if in a trance when I noticed that there was something, or someone looking back at me from the fifth-floor window. As soon as I made eye contact, it disappeared. The whole area, the building and the quiet creeped me out. I ran for home. That night Claire and I sat down together to watch a movie, drink some wine and talk. When I brought up my crazy ex-boyfriend, Claire laughed a little. She remarked that my ex sounded like her during her wilder days. She went on to tell me that she had a mental breakdown a few years ago and that she was on medication, but she was better now and it was all behind her. Her story sent a chill up my spine. I barely knew her and I learn about this. Later when I went to bed, I heard a crash outside my window. I threw back the curtain and saw Claire walking off the porch, breaking a flower pot as she moved. I opened my window and yelled her name, but she didn't respond. Claire was walking down the street toward the abandoned hospital, sleepwalking, her hand outstretched as if she was being guided by some unseen force. I threw on some clothes and ran outside the house, still calling Claire's name. By the time I caught up to her, she was stepping inside the hospital doors. Someone had unchained the doors. I was too afraid to walk inside the hospital after her. I hesitated and I regret it to this day. When I finally worked up the nerve to walk inside, I was greeted by an elderly homeless woman. I asked her if she had seen anyone come into the hospital just now, and all she did was smile at me and turn away. I panicked and stepped back outside. The foreboding feeling was overwhelming. I looked up at the hospital and saw Claire hanging out a window on the 5th floor. I yelled her name, but I couldn't get her attention. I'll never forget the look on her face. Pure terror. Claire kept leaning out the window and looking back into the hospital as if she was afraid of someone or something. Sometimes she'd look down, seemingly straight at me, but she still never saw me. I called her name desperately as I watched her climb out through the window and jump. She died in front of me. The police arrived and I told them everything about Claire's sleepwalking. But when they learned about her history of mental illness, they quickly chalked it up to a suicide, and that was the end of her story. A week later, I read her obituary in the newspaper, and in the article they confirmed that the abandoned hospital was in fact a hospital. A mental hospital. I fell asleep that night. I had a very strange dream. I was walking down the hall of a hospital, a woman in a hospital gown holding my hand. She was guiding me somewhere, and she kept looking back to make sure I was still following. The snapping of fingers and a man's voice startled me awake. I had been dreaming. I had been sleepwalking. I had walked the 4 blocks from my house to the street of the abandoned hospital. A man had almost hit me with his car. If he hadn't have woken me up, I'm not sure what wouldn't happened. The idea of sleep was now terrifying. So much had happened in such little time. I tried to keep awake for as long as possible. But eventually, as it often does, sleep overtook me. The dream, the same dream about being in the hospital, repeated. This time when I woke up, however, I wasn't in my bed or standing in the street. I was laying the bed frame of an old cot inside the hospital. Scared, I walked through the halls trying to find the stairs and get out, but I found nothing. I heard muffled voices and screams coming from all the empty rooms that lined the halls. I rounded a corner and came face to face with 3 people all dressed as patients. One patient was the woman from my dream. I backed away and told myself they weren't real. If I ignored them, they'd go away. I kept searching for the exit and heard another screaming voice from behind a door. There was an orange glow creeping out from under the door and through the small window on the door. I peeked inside and a man's face peeked back. His face was burned, horribly burned. He begged me to let him out, but I couldn't bring myself to touch the door. I turned and saw the same 3 patients as I had before. One by one the 3 patients approached the window and jumped out. I looked out the window, but I didn't see them. I saw 3 orderlies running from the building in a panic. I yelled for them, but they didn't stop. That's when I smelled the smoke. I turned and saw the orange flames stretching out from under the door and smoke filling every hallway. I had no choice. I had to jump. I approached the window and prepared to leap out when I felt a hand on my arm. I looked over and saw the homeless woman pulling me away from the window. She led me out of the hospital and I ran for my life. The rest of the night I stayed awake and did some research on the hospital. It was abandoned 20 years ago after a fire ravaged the hospital. The orderlies all fled from the building and left their patients behind to burn alive. I moved out of the house the next morning and back in with my parents. I haven't sleepwalked since. A true story. When it all began, I was a lonely 7th grader at a large public school. I had few friends there, and even these friends of mine bullied and mistreated me more often than not. So I made my friends at church. At this point in my life, I was deeply religious, even at such a young age. I prayed and read the Bible daily, and my family regularly attended church. However, no matter how much effort I put into my religion, I always felt a great distance between me and God. I could spend all day praying, but every time I tried, I still felt like I was talking to the wall. How could I know He was there at all if I couldn't see Him, couldn't hear Him, couldn't feel Him? But my father, oh, he could hear God just fine. I knew because he had seen them, seen the angels. My father and my mother, still married at this time, disagreed upon many issues, especially religious ones. So as the tension between them grew, my father turned to other sources of fulfillment. He began taking long walks each day, during which he would spend hours praying. He developed a kind of distant look in his eye, which constantly hinted at the fact that he was occupied with things outside our world. This only increased the tension in the household, as my mother accused him of being neglectful of household chores and duties. Then, when he and I were doing yard work one day, my father revealed to me his gift. "Son, this may sound strange at first," he told me, nervously clearing his throat, "but I had a vision from God." He then began to describe to me his vision. Jesus had led him to the top of a high mountain overlooking the whole world. Upon the mountain, Jesus told my father that he was sending him out as his servant to win back the world for the cross. My father resisted, claiming he did not have the gifts to take on such a task. Jesus then told my father that he was going to give him a special ability to aid him, the ability to see and communicate with spiritual beings. This would help my father complete his task. Still my father resisted, saying he was not worthy of such power. Jesus, becoming angry, swiftly brought my father down to the depths of hell. My father looked upon the lake of fire. Thousands of souls were drowning in its flames, wailing in agony. Their skin was bubbling and dripping off in large clots from the intensity of the heat. The hair was completely singed off their heads. Their bloodshot eyes burned red from the flaming tongues that continually licked them. My father grew sick to his stomach. "Do you see this?" Jesus said to him. "This is what will happen if you do not act soon. If you refuse to obey your calling, you shall be responsible for the eternal death of millions." I was speechless. But that was not all. My father then went on to tell me that in the days following the vision, He had begun to see the angels, just as Jesus had said he would. They're everywhere. They're invisible to human eyes, but I can see them. Dozens of them. They're the most majestic creatures. I had no idea what to say. How could I know, when my father had actually just told me in all earnestness that he suddenly had the power to see angels and spiritual beings? Was I losing my mind? Was this a strange dream? Yet, even as insane as it sounded, I wondered, was this the answer I had been looking for? I had never been able to hear God talk back to me before. Maybe that would all change now. Maybe I could finally see God, hear Him, feel Him myself. Dad, do you think one day I'll be able to see them too? Of course you will. It will take time, but if you have faith, nothing will be invisible to you. And so began my quest of faith, my quest to see these beings for myself, to see God. Over the next several months, my father shared with me his stories about his frequent encounters with the angels. He warned me never to tell another living soul, not even my mother. God had commanded him to keep his gift a secret from all except me. Car rides with my father became adventures, as he would describe his conversations with the beings. Usually they appeared to him during his solitary prayer walks, or while he was out anywhere by himself. Part of my father's gift was the ability to speak in angelic tongues, and it was in these tongues that he communicated with the angels. They would discuss the spiritual state of matters in the world, or go over details concerning my father's mission, or sometimes simply exchange words of wisdom. Each angel had a name and a distinct personality and appearance, all of which I have long forgotten. Most of these names I had never heard before, but once every so often my father would tell me how he had met Michael or Gabriel, or one of the other archangels. The vividness with which he reported his encounters to me was incredible. I felt as though I were there amongst the angels myself. The more I heard, the more urgently I wanted to see them with my own eyes. My father became my greatest hero. Obviously, he was the most pious man I had ever known. Who else but the saints had ever been blessed with speaking with spiritual beings on a daily basis? I quickly became obsessed with gaining my father's abilities. If only I was less sinful, less worldly, a little more like my father. Time passed, and as my father began to meet with the angels more and more, I became more and more frustrated with myself for not being able to see them. But I learned to be patient. My father assured me that my time would come. One day, I too would look upon with Gabriel with my own two eyes. School let out for the summer, and that left more time than ever for spiritual growth. My father embarked upon his God-given mission, working and preaching at Christian events and concerts. He often met other believers who recognized the spiritual power within him, and they would have long theological discussions. Meanwhile, I sought to bring myself up to par spiritually by praying and reading my Bible for hours every day. The journey was difficult, and I often felt that I was getting nowhere, but I held on to hope. And then, everything changed. It was toward the end of the summer, and our family, including my parents, my two sisters, my mom's parents, and myself, headed down to Destin, Florida, for a week-long vacation. Due to our financial situation and the limited number of vehicles, we had decided that my mother and sisters would fly by plane to Destin, while my grandparents drove down in one car and my father and I drove in another. The day of departure arrived, and my father and I climbed into our car with the bulk of the luggage, ready to embark upon the 14-hour drive to Florida. Naturally, it only took a few minutes before we began discussing spiritual matters. My father had more stories to share, and I listened eagerly. He spoke of his words with the angels and described their splendor, and as he kept telling me about it all, I again experienced that feeling of inadequacy and the desire to be able to see the angels too. At one point, I asked him what it was like to speak in tongues. "Oh, it's very simple," he told me. "You know when you're speaking their language because don't even have to try. The words just flow right out. That's because the Spirit of God is in you, inspiring the words. It's not really you who's talking at all. God is doing the talking through you. I hope I'll be able to speak in tongues someday, I said, sighing. You can right now if you have faith, my father replied. I can? You mean really? What did Jesus say to his disciples? What if you have faith even a little as a mustard seed? You can move mountains. Well, surely speaking in tongues is a lot easier than moving a mountain. Go on, try it. I was suddenly nervous. I didn't know what to do. Was this actually happening? Was I really about to try to speak an angelic language? After a long, awkward pause, I finally blurted out a jumbled pile of nonsense, just whatever came to my head. It was very short, maybe a sentence or two, if you could even call them sentences. I was embarrassed. I knew my father would laugh at me. You did it. See, my father exclaimed, much to my surprise. You just spoke their language. All you need is faith. I'm proud of you, son. I really did it then, huh? I said, trying to hide the fact that I wasn't convinced. I knew I had just made those words up. There was no Spirit of God involved. But I didn't want to disappoint my father, so I played along. I even talked myself into half believing that maybe I had done it, maybe I was just too young to realize it. Regardless, I never made a second attempt after that day. The vacation in Florida was a disaster. My mother and father argued practically the entire time, and it made everyone else just miserable. Looking back, that trip was one of the lowest points in their whole marriage. Much of the fighting was due to the fact that my father was becoming increasingly out of touch with the family as he was focusing on his time with the angels. Of course, I was the only one who knew this, but everyone could tell something was going on in his head. I wished I could just blurt out the truth and defend my father. I wanted to end the fighting and tell everyone that he was actually trying to save souls, and that meanwhile they were angry at him for it. The vacation finally ended, and the family went their separate ways for the return journey. My father and I once again were in the car alone. This time, things were much different. At one point, my father told me that he had something very terrible to tell me. I've been having more visions, he told me. I've been talking to God, and God told me that your mother is going to die. Soon. I turned still as stone. The world froze. My brain turned numb. I had just been told that my mother was going to die. I tried to digest it. The idea was almost too preposterous to fit in my head. He went on to tell me that he did not know how she would die, but that he had been given a date. He could not share the date with me, however, but it was to happen soon, in accordance with God's plan. Meanwhile, God had shown my father the woman he would marry when my mother had died. She was a woman he had met at one of the Christian concerts he had worked at. She would become our new stepmother. The rest of the trip was spent recovering from the news. As horrible as it was, I knew God must have had a plan. If I was to one day experience him fully, I would have to trust him in all things. I tried to remember that when we arrived back at home. A week later I was in Oregon visiting my cousins right before school started. My father had told me that he would stay in touch with me. I still did not know when my mother's time would come, and I was filled with anxiety from the suspense. I tried to enjoy my last vacation of the summer, but it was hard when I had to live with the fact that my mother might die any day. Then, about halfway through my trip, I checked my phone before I went to bed one night and saw I had a voice message. It was from my father. My heart skipped a beat. Not knowing what to expect, I reluctantly picked up the phone and called voicemail. I listened to my father's message. I could hear the sadness in his voice. "Hey, it's Dad. I have some bad news. I know this will be hard to take in. Remember how I said that God told me your mother was going to die? Well, today was supposed to be the day. Son, your mother is still very much alive. All the visions, all the angels, all the conversations with God, none of that was real. I've gone to the doctor and found out that I suffer from bipolar disorder and severe hallucinations. I am mentally ill, and I've been prescribed medication. I'm so sorry I drug you through all my craziness. I guess we have a lot to talk about. Give me a call when you get a chance. Bye. I set down the phone. Then I collapsed onto my bed and began sobbing. 5 years later, I am finally writing down the full account of this story. Maybe it has touched you. Maybe it has left you disappointed. My father still struggles with his mental illnesses today, but with counseling and medication he is able to live a happy, quiet life. He has spent many years rebuilding his relationship with God. He continues to pray and read the Bible daily, and he attends church every week. As for myself, I always find it hard to open up my Bible, and whenever I take a shot at saying a prayer, I usually feel like I'm still talking to the wall.